Cthulhu flew on his vast leathern wings across the gulf of space to conquer and rule this world. He had no other purpose. He revels in combat, warfare, bloodshed, and death. Conquest is his way, and the way of his spawn, who are like him in their general appearance, but smaller. Whereas Cthulhu is as large as a mountain, his spawn are little bigger than horses or cows. They also possess wings for flying through the air, and through the dark emptiness of space. They are said to resemble the octopus, but this is true only of their heads, which are hung in the front of their faces with tentacles that lift and writhe about in the air, for they are all by nature dwellers on the surface of the earth and in the air. It is only misadventure that casts them below the waves of the sea, which they loathe and despise with a passionate hatred, for this water prevents them from sending forth their thoughts across the face of the world to control those who worship them. When Cthulhu descended from between the stars to the dreaming earth, he found it ruled by the Elder Things, an ancient race possessing deep wisdom that also came to this world from the stars, but long before the coming of Cthulhu and his spawned army. Cthulhu thought to easily destroy the Elder Things, but to his amazement and dismay he found their arts of warfare equal to his own. His spawn swept against their slaves that are called Shoggoths the way an ocean wave sweeps toward the rocks of the shore, and it broke upon them just as a wave breaks and falls back in frustration. The Shoggoth is the strongest creature that has ever lived, and deathless. Not even the spawn could prevail against them. To end the war more quickly, the Elder Things were gracious and ceded to Cthulhu and his spawn the newly risen lands of the Pacific Ocean that formed chains of islands. With these the war god was content to bide his time, for he never ceased to plot the overthrow of the Elder Things and the conquest of this entire world. He and his spawn, which are smaller buddings of himself from his own body, sent forth their thoughts into the dreams of the other thinking creatures of the earth, bringing them into subjugation and servitude, until all worshipped Cthulhu as a god, including the hairy ape-like beings that would later become men. Alas for Cthulhu, the stars changed their pattern in the heavens, and sent down poisonous rays to vex him. He used his magic to place his spawn and himself into a sleep that was like death, but in his dreams he continued to send forth his thoughts, and to rule his worshippers. A second disaster struck, one unforeseen in spite of all his wisdom and ancient experience. The island of R'lyeh sank beneath the waves to the bottom of the sea with Cthulhu, and all his spawn locked within their stone houses, dreaming their strange dreams. The mass of water held back his thoughts and the thoughts of the spawn. There was no way to call his worshippers to release him should the stars came right once again in the heavens. So Cthulhu and his spawn continued to lie on sunken R'lyeh, deep beneath the waves, almost forgotten by men, but dreaming still of warfare and conquest. Statues of Cthulhu, carved from green stone that is not native to this world, revealed the strange shape of the dreaming god. He has a massive, bulging head that is soft and pulsing on the top, with 6 small eyes on the front, and below them a tangle of slender writhing tentacles resembling a nest of serpents that conceals his mouth. From his back hang his enormous wings, like those of a bat that are folded close. His body is like the body of a man, corpulent and of solid frame, but his hands and feet end in claws that are longer than the tusks of the greatest elephant. His flesh is said by those who claim to have glimpsed it in dreams to be like cloudy green glass that lets light pass through, and similar to jelly beneath the touch. But when it is cut it heals itself almost instantly and reforms. No injury of a normal kind can harm Cthulhu or his spawn. They are deathless, since they do not live as we know life. Those men who worship him have formed a cult in the far corners of the world, and passed down the ancient knowledge of R'lyeh. They worship his statues, but their priests receive no instruction from him, except at rare times when the gate of Yog-Sothoth opens upon R'lyeh, and they travel to the sunken citadel of their mighty lord and hold communication with him in their dreaming minds. Then does Cthulhu instruct them in the rites of his cult. He tells them to wait and watch for the stars to come right in their courses, and for R'lyeh to rise, for these are the signals that the time of slaying is come upon the world again, as it was before the making of man by the elder things. The worship of Cthulhu lends courage and skill in warfare and all forms of battle. In dreams Cthulhu teaches ancient wisdom and ancient magic, for he is the high priest of the old ones and well learned in all their alien arts. Only Nyarlathotep has greater wisdom, but the crawling chaos seldom teaches men matters of great value. Cthulhu is generous to his worshippers. He needs them to come and release him and his spawn from their stone houses once R'lyeh rises above the waves. He teaches them the joys of battle and the greater joys of slaying. His cult is fearless and without mercy or kindness. They gladly kill the innocent and embrace death as a lover. Use this seal of the war god to reach him in the depths of your dreams, or when you project your astral form beneath the waves to sunken R'lyeh, where you may hold communication with Cthulhu as he sleeps. The sphere of the heavens most in harmony with his warlike nature is the sphere of Mars. All things martial are suited to form a part of his worship and his rites. Of all the old ones, he most delights in sacrifices of blood. It is possible to invoke a shadow of his mind, and in this way take on the fierceness and mercilessness of the warrior god and his spawn. This is useful in achieving victory in battle or in contests. Cthulhu cannot bear to lose any contest. He cannot bear to decline any challenge. The magic square of the sphere of Mars, and the sigil formed from the name of Cthulhu upon that square are both useful instruments in seeking the aid or teachings of the dreaming god. His natural way among the 6 directions of space is the south, because its fiery nature accords with his lust for war. A final word of warning. It is possible to invoke a shadow of Cthulhu's mind into your own mind, and in this way take on the force of will, the fearlessness, the aggression, and warlike virtues of the god, but consider well before you attempt this, for Cthulhu glories in slaying and death, and is not fastidious about whom he slays. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Old Ones is a wholly remarkable book, perhaps the most remarkable, certainly the most successful ever to come out of the great publishing corporation of Miskatonic. More popular than How to Tame Amigo, better selling than 42 Incantations to Summon an Old One, and more controversial than Alhazard's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters where Cthulhu went wrong, some more of Cthulhu's greatest mistakes, and who is this Cthulhu person anyway? It's already supplanted the Encyclopedia Cthulhuinca as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom, for 2 important reasons. First, it requires slightly less sacrifices, and secondly it has the word "Stay Sane" printed in large friendly letters on its cover. The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. Not in the spaces we know, but between them, they walk serene and primal, undimensioned and to us unseen. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of old, and where they shall break through again. He knows where they have trod earth's fields, and where they still tread them, and why no one can behold them as they tread. As a foulness shall ye know them. Their hand is at your throats, yet ye see them not, and their habitation is even one with your guarded threshold. Words of the first prophet Alhazrad in the Necronomicon. Yog-Sothoth is the key and the gate, the opener of the way to realms beyond the ken of mortal minds. He is not a being of flesh and blood, but a cosmic entity that transcends space and time, existing in the interstices between dimensions. He is the guardian of the secrets of the universe, and the source of all knowledge and power. He is also the father of abominations, spawning horrors that defy description and sanity. To behold him is to gaze upon the ultimate horror, a swirling mass of iridescent spheres and tendrils that emit a dreadful sound like the piping of flutes. He knows all things that are, were, or will be, and he can grant his worshippers access to forbidden lore and dark magic. But he demands a terrible price for his favors, for he is hungry for the souls of men, and he will devour them without mercy. He is not a being of flesh and blood, but a cosmic entity that transcends space and time, existing in the interstices between dimensions. He is also a manifestation of the dimension of time, or even the dark tapestry, the realm of the outer gods. He has no fixed appearance, but he sometimes manifests as a mass of glowing orbs or a mass of black tentacles. He is the source of all knowledge and power, and the father of many abominations. He was born from the nameless mist, one of the offspring of Azathoth alongside the darkness and Nyarlathotep. He is also the progenitor of Cthulhu, Hastur the unspeakable and the ancestor of the Vurmi. He is also the father of Wilbur Whateley. In our limited and feeble dimensions, the unspeakable horror that is Yog-Sothoth manifests itself as a monstrous conglomeration of iridescent globes, each one a window to a different realm of madness and terror. These globes are never at rest, but constantly undergo a hideous and unnatural motion and reorganization, shifting their positions and sizes, flowing into one another with a sickening sound, and breaking up to coalesce again in new and dreadful forms. The globes are not bound by any law of cohesion or gravity, and may spread over a vast and appalling area, defying all attempts to measure or comprehend their extent. No human eye can bear to look upon this abomination for long, and no human mind can grasp its significance or purpose. Even primitively equipped investigators can contact Yog-Sothoth. However, this entity is notoriously dangerous, and non-specialists should avoid contact. Prolonged or indeterminate contact with Yog-Sothoth has been demonstrated to be deleterious to the local continuum. Touching Yog-Sothoth as substance is to be avoided. Blisters, desiccated tissue, and exposed bones typically result from such contact. Yog-Sothoth is one of the cryptic Old Ones, whose contact with humanity has fortunately been minimal of late. It is unknown whether Yog-Sothoth is a representative example of those beings. Unfortunately, scant data suggests that contact with any Old One is most inadvisable. Yog-Sothoth primarily inhabits an interstitial zone between various dimensions and planes, rendering it contentious with all time and space. Yog-Sothoth can be encountered anywhere in this universe. Even in ancient texts, Yog-Sothoth is the opener of the way and the provider of strange wisdom. This attribute was confirmed by Hutchinson. Most hard metaphysicians still routinely turn to Yog-Sothoth as the key intermediary for reconnaissance and exploration of otherwise inaccessible interstellar bodies and dimensions. Our knowledge of Yog-Sothoth and the other Old Ones is at present so minimal that printed speculation concerning origin, powers, rank, or significance would be disinformation. He is an unfathomably powerful deity and one of the most powerful of the outer gods, a race of ancient deities who wield great power, size, and intelligence, as well as the largest and most intelligent, dwarfing the famous Cthulhu in the same scale that Cthulhu dwarfs humanity, and is a truly cosmic menace that is beyond mortal comprehension. Yog-Sothoth is the embodiment of all of time and space across an essentially infinite number of space-time continuums. For all intents and purposes, he is connected to the multiverse. He is the grandfather of Cthulhu and the grandson of Azathoth. Like many Lovecraftian deities, Yog-Sothoth has a number of avatars and even followers by which to expand his influence. It is an entity of vast knowledge and power, and those who treat with it may learn much. Any who do so must be wary. However, as with many of the creatures of the beyond, the mere sight of Yog-Sothoth's full form is sufficient to drive the mortal mind over the edge of insanity. Some witches and other practitioners of magic use the name Yog-Sothoth in their incantations, usually for the purpose of necromancy. This is a dangerous task, since the Yog-Sothoth's incomprehensible power and nature can turn any man insane. The deity is also known to contact humans, giving them magical powers, usually for the goal of spreading his influence, and eventually releasing him. Some notable humans who worship Yog-Sothoth are Abdul el-Hazard, a sorcerer from 8th century Damascus, who wrote the Necronomicon, a book filled with knowledge of the Great Old Ones. Joseph Kerwin, a sorcerer from 17th century Massachusetts, who managed to get magical powers from the deity for his necromancy and life extension. The cult of Yog-Sothoth is not an organized religion. Worshippers of Yog-Sothoth tend to be isolated and often insane arcane spellcasters, such as alchemists, sorcerers, and wizards, searching for hidden eldritch secrets, and hoping that Yog-Sothoth will reveal these mysteries to them in exchange for their worship. Other common worshippers are cults composed almost exclusively of witches. They believe that Yog-Sothoth will grant them great power, and that his increasing intrusions are a sign that he is taking an active interest in Golarion. All are prone to bicker and fight among each other as much as they fight with others. Yog-Sothoth's followers believe that he is preparing for the awakening of the Great Old Ones on various planets, whose inhabitants will be wiped out to make way for the true masters. Cultists often call upon him to bless pregnant women, leading to the birth of children and spawn of Yog-Sothoth that shall prepare the world for when the stars are right and the Great Old Ones rule again. Some others worship Yog-Sothoth as a deity of time and space, and have called upon him in order to learn about or travel to distant places or times. They describe him as a non-evil guardian of the secrets of the cosmos' true nature who reveals them to those who ask, yet the very act of interacting with Yog-Sothoth is dangerous to one's life and sanity. Ultimately, Yog-Sothoth cares little for mortal worship, as he has no real need of it except for one purpose: worshippers who will either directly summon him into our realm of existence themselves, or who will mate with him to produce a spawn of Yog-Sothoth or child of Yog-Sothoth who will summon its progenitor instead. Once summoned to our realm, Yog-Sothoth would be free to ravage the surrounding area and consume any and all lifeforms he can reach, corrupting the very space and time he touches with his foul and unnatural presence. Yog-Sothoth, like the other outer gods, is unable to manifest in the physical plane. It must rely on a series of avatars to do its bidding. Some of these are a Forgaman, a time master, the aspect of Yog-Sothoth who keeps the flow of time. He was revered by many cultures past, present, and future as the god of time because of his preternatural ability to manipulate time and space. Little is known of this being's appearance because he only reveals himself to those who have angered him. However, it is known that he is accompanied by a blinding light. He is the mortal enemy of Xexenoth. Amrat-Tol, an amiable avatar who guards the gate of truth. Known as the most ancient and prolonged of life, he presides over the timeless halls beyond the gate of the Silver Key and the strange, near-omnipotent ancient ones that dwell there. He is described as the silhouette of a man behind a strange, shimmering veil. He is one of very few apparently benign Lovecraftian Great Old Ones who does not cause insanity in those who view him and is one of Yog-Sothoth's more benevolent avatars. Tsathoggua, also known as Tsathoth, a fake guardian angel that became the partner and host for Abigail Williams. The Eater of Souls, an avatar of Yog-Sothoth worshipped by the Loigar, this facet is believed to devour some kind of life force from living beings, a substance that the Loigar needed for an unstated purpose. Yog-Sothoth is among the most powerful beings in existence, capable of rivaling Kalar and Kronos, with its power being almost equal to that of its creator. It is a limitless cosmic being that is connected with all of space and time yet is locked away from mainstream reality. This monstrous deity sees all and knows all and can impart knowledge to anyone foolish enough to seek its favor, which often required human sacrifice or worse and would ultimately bring calamity and ruin to the would-be follower. The entity is so powerful that merely seeing it or learning too much about its existence would drive one insane and create disaster. He is considered to be absolutely boundless from the perspectives of almost all beings, but is in truth implicitly restricted by Azathoth. Regardless, Yog-Sothoth is considered to be of equal importance to Azathoth, as numerous individuals seek to release him in order to unleash the Old Ones from their prison. He is nigh omnipotent, As one of the strongest of the outer gods, Yog-Sothoth possesses unimaginable power that rivals both Azathoth and Nyarlathotep, allowing him to do almost anything and everything. This allows him to wield supreme power capable of even annihilating some of the Arkuthas and Primordials nigh effortlessly. Nigh invulnerable, being one of the most powerful out of outer gods, Yog-Sothoth is, by all technicalities, practically indestructible. He is omniscient, likely due to his position. Yog-Sothoth sees all, knows all, and is all, and possesses the vast sapience that not even his grandfather can lay claim to due to his damaged mind. Every being that possesses intelligence is considered a mere facet of Yog-Sothoth, from a mere human to the most complex outer god. He has also shown to be able to bestow this omniscience to those he deems worthy, such as Randolph Carter. Yog-Sothoth is himself all of the space-time continuum, and is omnipresent despite being locked away. Yog-Sothoth is omnilock and not bound by the regular space-time of the lower worlds, existing beyond it, meaning that it is completely locked away from the current mainstream reality and among other realities, with it being its own reality that inhabits an existence which is not connected to any of the branches of creation. As one of the most powerful outer gods, an avatar of Azathoth is immortal and is unable to be killed by any means. Only Azathoth himself can ultimately destroy him by absorbing him to become his ultimate self. Meta-space-time manipulation is one of Yog-Sothoth's abilities. He has control over all of space and time, can manipulate the space-time continuum of every reality, whether it be a higher dimension, a parallel universe, a dream world, and other. He is able to bend, distort, and alter the very fabric of existence anywhere and everywhere to his desire, even locations where time and space may not even exist. This includes the boundaries that separate the differing worlds and planes from one another, which can be utilized to reach cosmic endeavors, such as combining timelines, merging worlds and locations, even switching or replacing things between dimensions. In essence, the user is able to exploit anything within the confines of the multiverse or even the megaverse for their benefit. Yog-Sothoth can manipulate time of any and all realities, dimensions and universes, whether they are physical locations, such as higher dimensions, heaven or hell, or metaphysical locations such as the dream world. He can create temporal effects that can even affect incorporeal and metaphysical life forms who are normally at an alternate plane of existence, such as dream sprites, ghosts, and deities. Yog-Sothoth's name was first mentioned in Lovecraft's novella The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, first published 1941. In The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, his name is part of an incantation that could revive the dead and, with some of the syllables reversed, slay the creature raised. He goes on to be the driving force of the short story The Dunwich Horror, in which he fathers twin children with a human. Yog-Sothoth has some connection to the mysterious Old Ones mentioned in the Dunwich Horror 1929, but their nature, their number, and their connection to Yog-Sothoth are unknown. Nonetheless, they are probably allied to him in some way, since during the story, old Whateley gives up his own daughter, Lavinia, and sacrifices her to Yog-Sothoth, who impregnates her with two children, Wilbur Whateley and the Dunwich Horror. Wilbur Whateley, being the half-human son of Yog-Sothoth, tried to summon them so that they could control Wilbur's more tainted twin and make it reproduce, but a dog mauled him to his death. The Horror later begs for Yog-Sothoth to save it when defeated and is struck dead by a lightning bolt. He later appeared in At the Mountains of Madness in connection to the thing beyond the mountains that even the elder things fear. William Dyer and Danforth, after escaping a Shoggoth, leave the mountains on their plane. Danforth looks back and sees something that causes him to go insane. He refuses to tell anyone, even Dyer, what he saw, though it is implied that it has something to do with what lies beyond the larger mountain range that even the Old Ones feared. It is theorized that this entity was an avatar of Yog-Sothoth. Yog-Sothoth is coterminous with all time and space, yet is supposedly locked outside of the universe we inhabit. Its cosmic nature is hinted at in a passage from Through the Gates of the Silver Key 1934 by Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price. In this story, Charles Randolph Carter actually meets him, the gate, the key, and the guardian. The encounter makes it very clear that it is the point of view which defines the nature of the interaction. There is nothing inherently evil or frightening about him. He opens the gates of the multiverse to anyone who is willing to glimpse it, and unlike the nameless devourers, he is not going to harm you or force you into what you do not want. He gives Carter the option of leaving or going forward. The price is to see the true or at least partial vastness of what is, a flood of knowledge that overwhelms the current self. Once Carter is at the nexus of all he is, was and will be, he is distilled into one being, a wizard on a planet engaged in a battle. Yet all Carter wants is to go back to Earth. How limited are we truly, and what does it take to move on beyond? The Horror from the Bridge by Ramsey Campbell. 1. Clopton, Gloucestershire, is not a name which can be found on any map, and of the inhabitants of the few leaning red brick houses which remain of the uptown section of the once prosperous town, there is not one person who can remember anything of that period of horror in the town in 1931. Those in Brichester who heard the rumors that filtered out of the terror-clutched town deliberately refrain from recounting what they learned, and they hope that the monstrous series of events will never become generally known. Nobody, in fact, knows quite why that 20-foot-high concrete building was erected on the bank of the Tun, the tributary of the Severn which flows near what used to be the riverside section of Clopton. Nor can they tell why a band of men tore down all the buildings which lay anywhere near the river, leaving only that sparse remnant of uptown Clopton. And of the eldritch sign which was clumsily engraved in each wall of the concrete riverside building, Brichester folk do not like to think. If one asks the professors at the university, they will answer vaguely that it is an extremely ancient Kabbalistic symbol, but one is never told exactly what the symbol is supposed to invoke, or against what it may be intended as a protection. The whole affair, in fact, is a curious conglomeration of hints and avoidances, and perhaps it would never have been known what actually took place in Clopton in 1931 had not a typed document been found in the house of a deceased Brichester recluse. It seems that this recluse had recently been preparing the document for publication, and possibly it may be better that such a document was never published. For, in fact, the document is a description of the horror by one of those who tore down the riverside buildings. In view of what he recounts, it is understandable that he became reclusive. The writer, Philip Chesterton, obviously intended his document to be as scholarly a document as possible. His reclusiveness, stemming, for reasons not to be conjectured, from 1931, allowed him a great deal of time to investigate the historical aspects of the affair through his large stock of volumes on the Roman occupation of Britain and following events. Other tomes, indeed, made it possible for him to include a good deal of historical and genealogical data about the people of Clopton, though this does not give more than a composite picture of the small population of the town, and does not add any information for those seeking to learn all factors affecting what erupted at the beginning of that cataclysmic period. Admittedly, however, certain legends and quasi-historical tales about some of the people of Clopton may be taken as hints of the eventual explanation of that problematic flood of 1931, but it is undeniably difficult to assess the true worth of various peculiar tales which Chesterton seems to have believed. The intrinsic value and veracity of several pivotal descriptions in the following transcription, which is a version, in some places severely cut, of the document found in the Brichester house, must therefore be considered carefully by the reader. In 1800, according to the manuscript, a strange visitor moved into an empty house on Riverside Alley, a little tenanted street within sight of a bridge over the Tun. The townsfolk could learn little about him, save that his name was James Phipps, and that he had come from Campside because his unorthodox scientific researches were distasteful to the inhabitants. Of course this was when the Reverend Jenner's witch hunts were at their height, so that these researches may have been taken for witchcraft. People living near the Riverside Street noticed the anomalous instruments and cases which were carried into the house by two furtive-looking rustics. Phipps seemed to direct operations with singular care, and came near to fury when one of the men almost slipped while carrying something which appeared to be a statue wrapped in thick canvas. The gaunt, pallid-faced man, with his jet-black hair and long bony hands, must have affected the watchers with strange feelings. After some days had elapsed since his arrival, Phipps began to haunt taverns near the river. It was noticed that he never drank anything, and was once overheard to remark that he was averse to alcohol. It seemed, in fact, that he came there solely to discuss affairs with the less reputable inhabitants of Cloton, in particular, to learn of the prevalent legends of the countryside. In time, of course, he heard of the legend that a demon had once lurked nearby, and showed great interest in the story. The inevitable elaborations reached his ears. The belief of one or two people that a whole race of abominations was entombed somewhere in the vicinity, and the idea that a monstrous underground city could be discovered if one found the entrance which was reputed to lie submerged under the turbulent river waters. Phipps showed unaccountable interest in the further idea that the alien monster or race had been sealed up in some manner, and could be released if the prisoning talisman were removed. He apparently held much stock by these curious legends, for he rewarded his informants very highly. To one or two he even suggested that they should send their sons to him for education in the sciences, but those approached were not interested in offers of this sort. It was in the spring of 1805 that Phipps left his home one night. At least, he must have moved in darkness, for nobody knew of his temporary removal until the silence and lightlessness of the building on Riverside Alley made them aware of it. The strange tenant, it seemed, did not deem it necessary to set any guard upon his house, beyond locking the doors and shuttering the windows, and indeed, nobody was sufficiently curious to investigate, for the barred house near the river remained silent and untouched. Some months later, in early November, Phipps returned to take up tenancy again. This time, however, he was not alone, for during his absence he had taken a wife, a woman with a similar corpse-like pallor, who was heard to speak little and walked with a peculiarly stiff gait. What information could be gathered about her was sparse, only revealing that her husband had met her in Temple, a nearby town in the Cotswolds, where he had journeyed to procure some extremely rare chemicals. They had met at some unnamed gathering, and Phipps showed strange caution in speaking of this mysterious gathering. Nothing more need be noted about the curious couple in the house bordering the river for some time after this. In late 1806 a son was born in that darkly brooding house, and some consider that this was the actual beginning of a series of events to reach so devastating a climax in 1931. The child, who was named Leano by his science-seeking father, was born on a day in November, of lashing rain and skies ripped by lightning. The people living near Riverside Alley used to say that a throaty and muffled rumbling had seemed to come from below the ground rather than from the throbbing sky. A few would even insist querulously that the lightning, often striking near the river, had once struck, in the form of a scintillating pillar of energy, directly through the roof of the Phipps homestead, even though no marks of such a phenomenon were afterwards found. The son was, at any rate, born of strange parents, and no such superstitious accounting for his abnormal inclinations in later life need be believed. It was in 1822, when Leano Phipps would have been 17 or 18 years of age, that his rumored instruction by his father commenced. Definitely passers-by would see faint gleams of light through the shutters which nearly always now were closed over the windows, and frequently muttered discussions or arguments between father and son were overheard. Once or twice these low-voiced conclaves took on a faintly ritualistic flavor, and those hearing the words would experience a vague sense of unease. A few passers-by would become sufficiently interested to peer through a crack in the shutter, upon which they might see the younger Phipps poring over some large and ancient tome, or assisting at some unknown and vaguely sinister-looking apparatus. It seemed obvious that the boy was passing through a period of initiation or instruction in some branch of knowledge, of a definitely outre kind, if one were to judge from reports. This period, it appears, continued well into the late months of 1823, and at its latter end a change was noted by the neighbors of the antique building on Riverside Alley. For one thing, whereas before only the woman of the household had been seen to leave the house, a series of nocturnal journeys now commenced. These were made by father and son with what seemed an extreme degree of caution, and the usual destination was thought to lie near the river. At one time the two were followed by a puzzled passerby, who returned to report that they had been engaged in some sort of survey of the ancient, moss-grown river bridge. They had even clambered down the banks to balance precariously above the swirling ebon waters, and at one time the father, examining one of the supports by the light of a lantern, let out a cry of what sounded like realization. His son seemed equally surprised when he joined the seeker, and both disappeared under the bridge. The watcher could not view the proceedings without revealing himself, and he made his way home with a turbulent mind. Then came that particularly anomalous occurrence which may explain a seemingly inexplicable accident which befell a visitor later. The younger Phipps was seen to leave the house following the strange visit to the bridge, and those who took interest in the actions of this family soon discovered that the young man had visited the local general suppliers to purchase pickaxes and spades, for what purpose he would not tell. Those expecting to see the two secretive tenants of the river-bordering lane engaged in some form of excavation were puzzled when no such occupation was noticed. While no excavation was visible anywhere on the surface, the peculiar evidence of some occupation of the men and the woman was soon evident. The nearby residents began to hear muffled sounds of digging and the noise of metal striking stone from somewhere adjoining the cellar of that much-discussed house in the alley. This series of sounds was not static in its location, for the sounds of excavating metal moved slowly, it seemed, in the direction of the river. These noises continued for some weeks, during which neither of the men was seen at all outside the house, and the woman only seldom. Finally, one night, perhaps 2 months later, a party of men entered the Riverside Alley building, carrying, among other things, doors and frames and an unaccountable amount of material apparently intended for reinforcing the doors. A great noise of working came from below the ground, mostly located near the house and later near the archaic river bridge. After the cessation of the sounds, lights were seen in the room thought to be the laboratory or room where the men carried out their secretive experiments. Next came a reverberation which suggested that the party was returning to the underground region, following which there was a silence lasting some moments, and finally a sound of rushing water somewhere below the earth. Shouts of amazement and terror were borne to the ears of those listening above, and a few minutes later a sound of something wooden crashing against stone, while an unpleasant reptilian odor rose to the shimmering stars. In an hour or so the party of men departed singly as stealthily as they had come. Early in 1825, the escape of a criminal from the nearby prison on Mercy Hill led a party of searchers from Brichester to come to Clawton, antedating seekers after something much more hideous by over a century. Despite James Phipps's insistence that no refugee was hidden in his house, one of the group would not be satisfied by this reiteration. He went alone into the forbidding house while the others searched nearby. But when the man had still not joined the main party, over an hour later they returned precipitously to Riverside Alley. They discovered him lying by the side of the road outside the house, unconscious and covered with water and slime. Upon regaining consciousness, the searcher recounted a strange tale. According to Chesterton's research, his tale ran: "When you all left, this man Phipps waited till you were out of sight, and then he showed me in. Upstairs there's only bedrooms, and so bare that I didn't even need to go over the threshold to see that there was nobody hiding. Almost too bare. Phipps seems wealthy enough. Where's all his money spent then? Downstairs there's the usual sort of thing, except facing on the street there's some sort of laboratory. He wouldn't show me in there at first, but I insisted. The place was full of machinery and bookcases, and over in one corner there was a glass tank full of liquid, with something like a green sponge covered with bubbles, floating in it. I don't know what it was, but looking at it almost made me sick. I thought I'd seen all the house, and then I heard footsteps coming up from below. A woman appeared in the kitchen, Phipps's wife, and I went in to ask her where she'd been. He gave her a sort of warning look, but she'd already blurted out that she'd been down in the cellar. Phipps didn't seem to want me to go down, But finally he opened a trapdoor in the kitchen floor and we went down some steps. The cellar's quite large and bare. Tools and panes of glass, and what looked like a row of veiled statues, nowhere you could hide. I was just making for the stairs when I noticed a door in the wall to the left. There was a lot of carving on it, and a glass window in the top half, but it was too dark for me to see through the glass. Anyway, it looked like a good hiding place. When Phipps saw where I was going, he yelled out something about its being dangerous, and started down the steps. At first I didn't see how it opened, because there was no doorknob. Then I noticed a brick in the wall just to the right of it which looked loose, and I pushed it in. There was a sort of grating noise, and another I couldn't place at the time, but now I think it was Phipps running back upstairs. The rest of what happened I don't understand. The door swung open as I expected when I pushed the brick into position, and then a flood of water poured into the cellar. I don't know what was behind that door. The water threw me backwards too quickly for me to see anything, but for 1 minute I thought a figure was standing in the open before it floundered into the cellar with the water. I only saw it as a shadow, but it was like something out of a nightmare, towering, necklace, deformed, ugh. It couldn't have been anything like that really, of course. Probably one of those statues I was telling you about. I didn't see it again, and I can't remember anything else till you revived me outside the house. But what sort of man is it who has doors in his house leading to underground rivers? No amount of pounding on the door of the house could elicit a response, and those in the party did not particularly like to enter that building of brooding secrets. They went away intending to return later with a warrant, but somehow this intention was forgotten on their return to Brichester. Their later capture of the escaped criminal restored a kind of sanity, and the peculiar rumors of demon-haunted catacombs were almost forgotten. 2. The death of James Phipps came in 1898, on a day of howling wind, on which the hills in the distance muttered subterraneously in curious rhythms. The people of the country spoke of invisible primal mountain presences which chanted in night caverns, even though professors at the university in Brichester told them of the probability of underground rivers. The nightjars which now and then skimmed over the hills cried in peculiarly expectant tones, almost as if they expected to capture the soul of the dying man, as the legends told in that countryside hinted. For a long time through that May afternoon Phipps' voice could be heard, strangely distorted, from a shuttered upper-floor window. At times it seemed to address someone, while at others the voice would wail nonsensical fragments in unknown languages. It was not until after the rise of the miasma-distorted moon that an anguished groan came from the dying man, followed by a united rising of affrighted nightjars, from where they perched lengthwise in the trees and watched the house from across the river with glinting eyes. They flew as if escaping from some pursuing horror, which some believe these psychopomps to have attempted to capture. Close upon this came faintly heard footsteps upon the stairs in the house, followed by the sound of creaking hinges and muffled splash rumored to have been heard in the lower regions of that house. Nothing was ever heard concerning the burial of any remains of James Phipps, although the son said he preferred to dispose of the corpse himself. The Clonton people could understand this, since the corpse of a man who had apparently lived decades over a century, and practiced unknown sciences and experiments in secret, might necessarily be hidden from the eyes of the curious. It is very probably fanciful superstition which leads to scattered references to late travelers glimpsing someone very like Phipps in appearance near various hills topped by rings of monolithic stones, long after his death. But these same stone-capped hills often bore a nauseating reptilian odor which is not so easily explicable when linked with ensuing events. Lionel Phipps and the unnamed Temp Hill woman were left in sole possession of the house, and evidently a rift began to open at once between them. For some days a light burned at most times behind the shutters of the laboratory, where the son was thought to be studying whatever books he now inherited. This attracted the attention of the owner of the adjoining house, Mary Allen, and as she could easily hear the conversations from next door through the thin wall when she was interested, her discoveries supplied Philip Chesterton with very useful information. Some days after Phipps' death, for instance, Mrs. Allen overheard an interesting altercation. She heard only part of it, actually entering her own house just as Nyarlathotep began to shout angrily. "I need the tables for the positions of the orbits, I tell you," he was shouting. "He must have copied it down somewhere, but there's nothing about it here. If he left it in the laboratory, it's certainly not in there now. Are you sure you haven't?" "I haven't seen them," came the terrified answer. "You know I wouldn't go near them. Maybe I was in the temple gathering, but this sort of thing terrifies me more than what I learned down there. Why do you have to carry on this meddling? Whoever shut away that from outside must have known what they were doing, so why do you have to be so bent on setting it free? You've taken the chart, haven't you?" threatened Nyarlathotep. "You've taken it so I can't let them back in." No, I haven't," his mother protested. "Don't jump to conclusions until you've been through the whole house, at least." This temporarily satisfied Phipps, who presumably went to the laboratory, for the lamp in there was lighted again a few minutes later. The search of the house proved unavailing, however, and another furious argument took place. The mother still insisted that she neither knew of the hiding place of the notes, nor did she know the actual information which he sought. "Well," Phipps conceded, "perhaps you don't, but anyway it makes no difference now. Before the time comes I'll go down to London and look up the British Museum copy of the Necronomicon. That's bound to have the chart. And don't try to persuade me not to go ahead with Father's work. Of course, you don't have to stay around. It might be better if you went back to your coven in Temple. Satanism is so much healthier, isn't it?" "You know I need," began his listener. "Oh, of course, I forgot," admitted Nyarlathotep satirically. "Well, just don't interfere in my business here. I won't stand for it." The expected trip to London and the British Museum came in early 1899, and Nyarlathotep found little difficulty in gaining access to that section of the library which contains the rarer books. The librarian did not like the pallid face and leanness of the visitor, but he unlocked the bookcases containing the restricted volumes readily enough. The seeker speedily realized that the monstrous work of Abdul Alhazard would be useless to him in his quest. While it did contain an astrological table, this was very incomplete and long outdated. The even older tome, the Book of Ibn, appeared to him a possible source, with its records of the knowledge of an elder civilization. The librarian discovered that Phipps was attempting to find the position of some sphere Glaiaho in an obscure relationship with a system of orbits on a certain autumn night, Glaiaho, translated from that terrible primal tongue, being Betelgeuse. That little-known table in the complete Book of Ibn which gives positions of suggestive far worlds was quickly found by Phipps, from which he copied down parts of the table. The keeper of the books shuddered as he peered over the visitor's shoulder, and translated the names of Aldebaran and the Hyades in Phipps' notations. He disliked, too, the walk of the seeker as he left the echoing room, for it appeared that he had some slight difficulty in using his limbs. The librarian might have shivered more had he known of the forthcoming results of this visit. The return of Phipps, late in the evening, to the house on Riverside Alley, brought the most serious, and last, quarrel between the two remaining inhabitants of the building. Towards its end both were screaming at each other, and the listening Mrs. Allen found their remarks terrifying. Phipps was yelling something which first brought Mrs. Allen to listen closely. "All right, you try and stop me," he told his mother, "and I'll forget to operate next time you need it. You have to keep in my good books, or else you won't last out. You wouldn't even be here on this earth if it wasn't for that meeting in Temple. You'll tell them about my plans, will you? If the people in this town knew what they found in Temple in 1805 just after the day they met, you might be disposed of quickly." She shrieked back, "The people in this town won't be able to do anything if you go on with your father's work. There'll be other tenants in Claton. Wasn't the tunnel from the gate to the cellar enough? You know I wouldn't be able to protect myself if I let them through the cellar entrance." Phipps sounded defensive. "So just because you're a coward, do you have to let them through the other way?" she inquired. "Once the sign's removed there'll be no way to keep them in check. They'll just multiply until they let the old ones back on the earth." Is that what you want? Why not? Suggested her son. We both worship the old ones. The river creatures won't harm me. We'll exist side by side as their priests, until they return to rule the world. Side by side, you're naive, Phipp's mother scoffed. Still, perhaps the juxtaposition of Fomalhaut and the Hydes won't be enough. Even you may get tired when you have to wait more than 30 years. I'm not staying to see what happens. I'll go back to Temple and chance what should have come years ago. Perhaps it'll be the best thing. At about 11 o'clock that night the front door opened, and a strange woman began to walk down the street. A vaguely terrible picture was presented to the warily watching Mary Allen, as James Phipp's widow made her way with that half-paralytic gait which seemed to be a characteristic of all the Phipps family, between the dark houses under a lich pale moon. Nothing more was ever heard of her, though a woman was seen walking very slowly, and with some difficulty, along a road some miles away in the direction of Temple. Daylight showed a strange horror, for a little way further on a woman's skeleton was found, as though it had fallen at the side of the road. Body snatching seemed the most plausible explanation, and the matter was discussed little. Others to whose ears it came, however, linked it indefinitely with references to something that should have come a century ago. After this breach, Lionel Phipps began to make an increasing number of journeys to that immemorially constructed river bridge, and was noticed to go underneath to peer into the water frequently. At night he would step into the street at various hours and examine the sky with an excessive degree of impatience. At such times he appeared to be interested in a portion of the sky where, from directions given, Fomalhaut would have risen. Towards the end of March 1899, his impatience began to ease, and a light would be seen more often in the library. He seemed to be preparing for something extremely important, and those who heard the sounds which emanated from the shuttered laboratory disliked to consider just what he might be awaiting. Early that autumn came the night concerning which the Brichester people began to grow reticent. Fomalhaut now glared like the eye of some spatial lurker above the horizon, and many tales began to be whispered abroad about the increasingly frequent happenings around Gloucestershire and the Severn. The hill rumblings were louder and more coherent, and more than once people forced to take forest routes had sensed vast and invisible presences rushing past them. Monstrous shapes had been glimpsed scuttling through the trees or flapping above the stone circles on the hills, and once a woman had come fleeing into Brichester, shrieking a tale of something which had looked very like a tree but had suddenly changed shape. On a night at the peak of these bizarre occurrences, Phipps made his first experiment. He was seen leaving the house on an evening of late October, 1899, and seemed to be carrying a long metal bar of some sort. He arrived on the river bank near the bridge at about midnight, and immediately began to chant in ritual tones. A few minutes later the hill noises redoubled in intensity, and a peculiar sound started up close at hand, near the bridge, a monstrous bass croaking which resounded across the countryside. What appeared to be a minor earthquake followed closely on the beginning of the croaking, shaking the river bank and causing slight turbulence in the water, though nothing more. Phipps then disappeared under the bridge, and through his continued chanting rang the sound of metal scraping on stone. Upon this sound came a subterranean commotion, with a rising chorus of voiceless croaking and a sound as if of cyclopean bodies slithering against one another in some charnel pit, with a nauseating rise of that alien reptilian odor. But nothing came into view, even though the scrape of metal against stone continued with greater ferocity. Finally Phipps appeared above the bridge's shadow again, with an expression of resignation on his face. He made his way back to the house in the alley, as that abominable commotion died out behind him, and entered, closing the door stealthily. Almost at once the light filtered out from the shuttered laboratory where, presumably, he was again studying the inherited documents. Seemingly, Phipps was becoming unsure whether he was using the right chant, for that was what he told the British Museum librarian, Philip Chesterton, this now being the year of 1900. Phipps preferred not to say which incantation he needed, or what he hoped to invoke by its use. He made use of the Necronomicon this time in his search, and Chesterton noted that the seeker appeared interested in those pages which dealt with the commission of beings and tampering with the elements. The reader copied down a passage and continued to another section of the volume. Chesterton, reading over the other's shoulder, noticed that he showed considerable interest in the following passage, and shuddered to think of possible reasons. As in the days of the seas covering all the earth, when Cthulhu walked in power across the world and others flew in the gulfs of space, so in certain places of the earth shall be found a great race which came from outside and lived in cities and worshipped in dark fanes in the depths. Their cities remain under the land, but rarely do they come up from their subterranean places. They have been sealed in certain locations by the seal of the elder gods, but they may be released by words not known to many. What made its home in water shall be released by water, and when Ghatanothoa is rightly placed, the words shall cause a flood to rise and remove at last the seal of those from Ghatanothoa. Phipps admitted to his listener that he would have a considerable wait before anything could be done towards the release of what he knew to exist, but, he continued, it won't be too long before those in Cloton will see shapes striding down their streets in broad daylight that would drive them insane at night. In the old days the Shoggoths used to avoid those places where they peered out of the depths at unwary passers-by. What do you think will be the effect on a man who sees their great heads break the surface, and sees what they used to view him instead of eyes? Then he left, possibly conjecturing that he had said too much, and Chesterton was alone, with various speculations. As time went by, he began to investigate the doings of this eldritch being on Riverside Alley, and as a horrible idea began to form concerning the woman from Temp Hill, he contacted an acquaintance in that town. Legends, he was told, existed of a monstrous coven in the 1800s, which convened in artificial caverns beneath the graveyards. Often vaults would be opened, and newly buried corpses might be dug forth and reanimated by certain horrendous formulae. There were even hints that these living cadavers were taken as wives or husbands by favored members of the cult, for the children resulting from such charnel betrothals would have primal powers which properly belonged only to alien deities. So horrified was Chesterton by what he learned and suspected that he apparently decided to do something about it. In 1901 he resigned from his post at the British Museum and moved into a house on Bold Street in Brichester, working as a librarian at Brichester University. He was bent on preventing Lionel Phipps's intentions, and those who visited Chesterton at his home in Brichester, where he lived alone among his vast collection of books, left oddly disturbed by his outre, half-incoherent ramblings. During library hours at the university he showed no signs of any such aberration as manifested itself in his free conversation, beyond a strange nervousness and preoccupation. But in his free time he tended to speak of nameless things in a frightful manner, half describing hideous things in a way which promised cosmic revelations if the listener would only be patient. God help us, what alien powers has Lionel Phipps got, lying dormant in that mad brain? That woman James brought back from the Temp Hill meeting of which he never spoke, was she merely one of the coven, or something which they raised from the tomb by their awful rites? Lionel was overheard to say that he had to perform operations so that she would last out. Maybe he meant that she would decay away if he didn't preserve her ghastly half-life. And now he's got the information he was after, there's no telling what he may do. What lurking terror is he going to release from wherever he knows it is hidden? He said there would be a considerable wait, though, if one knew the right words, one might be able to seal up whatever is lying in wait. Or perhaps Phipps himself could be destroyed. After all, a being which has been born out of such an abnormal union must be prone to arcane influences. As might be expected, those who heard his odd ravings did not act upon them. Such things might happen in Temp Hill or Goatswood, but they could not affect sane Brichester folk, where witchcraft was not, at least, practiced openly. The period of more than 30 years passed, and nothing occurred which could shake the complacency of those who dismissed Chesterton's theories with such assurance. To be sure, the staff at the university often met with terrors which they had never thought could exist, for they were sometimes called by the frantic inhabitants of various localities to quell phenomena which were rising from hiding. 1928 was a particular year of horror, with inexplicable occurrences in many places, both around the Severn and far beyond, and the professors were more inclined to credit the wild tales of beings from another plane of existence which impinged on this universe. But Chesterton was always very reticent in the presence of authority, and he mistakenly thought they would explain any unnatural situation in a supposedly scientific manner. He read astrological tables and arcane books more and more, and shivered when he noticed how closely the stars were approaching certain positions. Perhaps he was even then formulating a plan for the destruction of the legendary threat which Phipps was to release. His narrative is not specific on this point. Terror, meanwhile, was increasing among the more credulous Cloton inhabitants. They noted the loudness of the hill noises, and were quick to remark the frequent visits of Phipps to the bridge over the sluggish river, and the way the lights flashed far into the night in his laboratory. The importance attached to a seemingly trivial find by a child on Riverside Alley was startling, for all that had been found was a hurried sketch on a scrap of paper. The frantic search for this paper made by Chesterton, when he heard of it, startled the more enlightened men who knew him, though those at Brichester University might have been less inclined to scoff, for they were familiar with things whose existence is not recognized by science. When Chesterton managed to acquire the paper and compare it with an illustration in the Necronomicon, he found that these depicted the same species of incarnate hideousness, though in markedly different postures. The only plausible explanation for the sketch seemed to be that it had been drawn frantically by an eavesdropper outside the Phipps house, copied from some picture glimpsed through the shutters. At least, that was what Mrs. Allen suggested when she gave him the paper. From comparison with the sketch, Chesterton used the other picture to form a composite portrayal of the being, though the details of both pictures were vague. The thing had 8 major arm-like appendages protruding from an elliptical body, 6 of which were tipped with flipper-like protrusions, the other 2 being tentacular. 4 of the web-tipped legs were located at the lower end of the body, and used for walking upright. The other 2 were near the head, and could be used for walking near the ground. The head joined directly to the body. It was oval and eyeless. In place of eyes, there was an abominable sponge-like circular organ about the center of the head. Over it grew something hideously like a spider's web. Below this was a mouth-like slit which extended at least halfway round the head, bordered at each side by a tentacle-like appendage with a cup tip, obviously used for carrying food to the mouth. The whole thing was more than a simply alien and horrific monstrosity. It was surrounded by an aura of incredible, Ian's lost evil. The finding of this only roused the fear of the Cloton people to a more hysterical pitch, and they were quick in their perception of Phipps' growing stealth in his nocturnal ventures, the way he took devious routes in his ever-increasing visits to the river. At the same time, though nobody else was aware of it, Philip Chesterton was noting the approaching conjunction of stars and clusters, said to portend terrific influences. More, he was fighting against the urge to destroy the being in the house on Riverside Alley before the hidden primal race could be released. For Chesterton had pieced together a powerful formula from various pages of Alhazard, and he felt it might both destroy the surviving Phipps and seal the subterranean entities back into their prison. But dared he chance releasing elemental forces, even to prevent such impending hideousness as he suspected? Thinking upon the horribly suggestive illustrations he had acquired, his terror of the powers with which he was to tamper receded. So it was that on the night of September 2, 1931, 2 men were attempting to push back the veils which hold the lurking amorphousnesses outside our plane of existence. As nightjars cried expectantly in the hills, and increasing reports of nameless things seen by travelers terrorized the superstitious, the lights burned in the study of Philip Chesterton far into the night, while he drummed on an oddly carved black drum which he had procured from the university and began to repeat the dreadful formula he had worked out. At the same time, Lionel Phipps was standing on the bridge over the Severn tributary, staring at Fomalhaut where it glared over the horizon and shrieking words which have not been heard on the earth for eons. It can only have been a startling coincidence that a party of young men, carrying rifles which they had lent to a rifle range for the day, was walking along the bank of the Tun. Even less believably, They were making for the bridge just as Phipps completed the shocking evocation. At any rate, they saw what happened as the hysterically screaming voice ceased, and they recount things of such horror that one can only be thankful for Chesterton's remote intervention. What made its home in water shall be released by water, Alhazard had said, and the words of the long-dead sorcerer were proved in that chaotic scene. A bolt of lightning seemed to crash directly on the bridge, and the shattered stonework of a support momentarily revealed a circular seal, carven with an immense star, before the waters rushed to conceal it. Then the flood began, and the watching group had time only to leap back before a torrent of water shattered the banks and thundered repeatedly, and with incredible force upon the spot where the carven circle had appeared. There came a shifting sound from under the throbbing waters, and as the three men in the party watching moved backwards, a huge circular disk of stone rumbled through the liquid and smashed against the lower bank. It had been the seal over the legendary entrance to the hidden alien city. What happened after this transcended in shocking terror everything which had gone before. Chesterton was nearing the completion of his own invocation at this point. Otherwise the thing which was found dead on the riverbank could never have been destroyed by the men. It is surprising, indeed, that they could have retained enough sanity to try. As the waters began to slow their torrential rush, the watching three saw a dark object break the uniformity of the surface. Then a titanic, shadowy thing rose from the water and rushed across the bank with a revolting sucking noise towards the town nearby. The three did not have a great deal of time, however, to concentrate upon that looming figure, for at that moment Phipps turned towards them. In the dim moonlight they saw him sneer dreadfully, and a look of fearful evil started up in his eyes. He began to move towards them, his eyes seeming to stare at each of them, and they noticed him beckoning behind him, after which there came a sound as of something huge splashing out of the river. But they could not see what was behind Phipps. So, sneered that half-human being before them, this is the total of the strength which can be mustered by the great elder gods. Apparently he misunderstood the true intentions of the terrified three men. What do you know of the great old ones, the ones who seep down from the stars, of whom those I have released are only servitors? You and your Seleno fragments and your Puro star signs, what can you guess of the realities which those half-veiled revelations hint? You ought to be thankful, you imbeciles, that I'm going to kill you now, before the race below gets back into sway on the earth and lets those outside back in. And he moved towards them with the same dreadful look in his eyes. But it was not upon Phipps that the watchers fixed their eyes in stark terror. For the moonlight, weak as it was, showed them what towered beside him, 2 feet taller than himself, shambling silently towards them. They saw the shining network of fibers over the one eye organ, the waving tentacles about the gaping mouth slash, the shocking alienness of the 8 members, and then the 2 things were upon them. At that minute, however, in a house in Brichester, Philip Chesterton spoke the last word of his painfully acquired formula. And as the foremost of the men turned his rifle blindly on the 2 abominations before him, forces must have moved into operation. It can be only this that could account for the bullets actually penetrating the alien amphibian which Phipps had released, for the thing fell backwards and croaked horribly for some seconds before it writhed and lay still. As Phipps saw this, he launched himself at the foremost of the party, who fired again. The change which took place in Lionel Phipps must indeed have been swift, for the man with the rifle, braced against the impact of the leaping figure, was struck by a skeleton, clothed with rags of flesh, which shattered upon contact. The half-hysterical 3 turned towards the river, where a greater miracle was taking place. Perhaps moved by Chesterton's invocation, the pieces of the shattered seal were recomposing in their original shape and location. It may only have been imagination which caused the men to think they saw a shape thrust back into the concealed entrance. It is at any rate certain that whatever lay below in its eons forgotten prison was now once again sealed into that sunken hideaway. The nightjars were quietening their expectantly vibrating cries, and the turbulence of the waters had almost ceased. Not just yet could the men bring themselves to look at the monstrosity which they had shot, to ascertain that it was dead. Instead, they stared towards nearby Cloton, towards which they had seen a dim shape plunge some time before. The monster from beyond was at last loose on the world. 3. By the time that Philip Chesterton had reached the bank of the river outside Clawton, some time had elapsed, and during it several events had occurred. Chesterton, hastening to view the effects of his interference, had been delayed by the necessity of buying petrol, and also by his uncertainty where the sorcerer might be. Though he knew the man would be somewhere near water, it was some time before the bobbing lights and commotion of the crowd of evacuees who had come from the nearby town attracted him to the bridge. There he found more things than he had expected. The crowd would in any case have congregated near the bridge, no doubt, since the noise of shots and other things would have drawn them, but actually they had been forced to evacuate from Clawton. Built above the normal floodplain of the Tun, the town had been partially inundated by the abnormally provoked flood. The section near the river had become a morass of submerged streets and basements. Those so driven from their homes had made for the bridge. The banks of the river were actually higher land than the lowlying downtown quarter of Clawton, and the hills which lay on the other side of the town were precarious at night if one wanted to hurry for help to Brichester. At the bridge, of course, the already frenzied townsfolk met with a scene which only aggravated their hysteria, and this was not alleviated by the tales of several people. Chesterton heard clearly the wails of one woman as he came up. She was telling the bystanders, "I was just going up to bed when I heard these shots and yells down by the river. I came downstairs and peeped out o' the front door down the street, but I didn't see anything. Anyway, all this running up and down had woken me up, so I went into the kitchen and got a sleeping tablet. Just as I was going back through the front room I heard this sort o', well, I don't know, it sounded like someone running, but bare feet, and sort o' weft sounding. Looked out o' the winder, but there wasn't anything. And then something went past the winder, big and black and shiny, like a fish. But God knows what it was. Its EAD was level with mine, and the winder's 7 foot off the ground." Nor was this all Chesterton heard recounted when he arrived. He had not yet seen the horribly incomplete remains of Phipps, nor that other object which lay in shadow some distance away, for the crowd was being skillfully directed away from the two monstrosities by a surprisingly sane 3 men, the same ones who had been partly responsible for their destruction. Now, however, the 3, sensing his instinctive authoritative bearing, converged on him and began to recount their terrible experience, supplementing their account by pointing out the remains of Phipps and his dreadful companion. Even though Chesterton had formed a good idea of the appearance of the river creatures, he could not suppress a gasp of revulsion as the being was revealed. The sketch and the Necronomicon illustration had not reproduced everything. They had not shown the transparency of the half-gelatinous flesh, revealing the mobile organs beneath the skin. Nor had they shown the globular organ above the brain, at whose use Chesterton could only guess shudderingly. And as the mouth fell open when they stirred the body, he saw that the being possessed no teeth, but 6 rows of powerful tentacles interlaced across the opening of the throat. Chesterton turned away, nauseated by this concrete symbol of cosmic alienage, to move back and speak to 1 or 2 of the affrighted crowd, who had no idea of what lay nearby. He twisted around again as a choking cry of horror came behind him, and under the fast-sinking moon, he saw one of the 3 men struggling with the tentacles of the river monster. It stood semi-erect on its 4 lower legs, and was dragging the man towards the yearning members about the mouth. The globular device in the head was pulsing and passing through shocking metamorphoses, and even in this position, Chesterton noticed that the river had momentarily washed almost to the edge of the crowd, and the water was being levitated into an orifice in the head above the globe. The distance between the wide gaping mouth and the victim was momently lessening, while the companions of the man were standing seemingly paralyzed with terror. Chesterton snatched a rifle from the hands of one of them, aimed it, and stood temporarily uncertain. Recollecting that the being had only been put out of action by the other bullet because of his own incantation, Chesterton doubted whether another shot would harm it. Then, as he saw that pulsing sphere in the head, a conjecture formed in his mind, and he aimed the weapon at the organ, hesitating, and pulled the trigger. There was a moist explosion, and the watchers were spattered with a noisome pulp. They saw the being sink to the ground, its legs jerking in spasmodic agony. And then came an occurrence which Chesterton would not write about, saying only that very soon almost no remains of the monstrosity existed. And, as if they had reacted in delayed fashion to the destruction of the being, the crowd now shrieked in unity of terror. Chesterton saw before he turned that the intended victim was indeed dead, whether from pure terror or from the embrace of the tentacles, for where these had gripped, the man's flesh was exposed. Then he turned to look where the mob was staring, and as they too stared in that direction, his two companions remembered what they had seen heading for the town in those recent lunatic minutes. The moon had sunk nearly to the horizon, and its pallid rays lit up the roofs of the Cloton houses behind which it hung. The chimneys stood up like black rooftop monoliths, and so did something else on one of the nearer roofs, something which moved. It stumbled on the insecure surface, and raising its head to the moon, seemed to be staring defiantly at the watchers. Then it leapt down on the opposite side, and was gone. The action was a signal to the waiting crowd. They had seen enough horrors for one night, and they fled along the riverside path which, dangerous as it was, seemed more secure than any other means of escape. Chesterton watched as the lights faded along the black river, and then a hand touched his arm. He turned. The two remaining members of the party which had killed Phipps stood there, and one awkwardly said, "Look, you said you wanted to destroy them things from the river, and there's still one left. It was them did for Frank here, and we think it's our duty to get 'em for him. We don't know what they are, but they went and killed Frank, so we're bloody well going to try and kill them. So we thought that if you needed any help with killing that last one." "Well, I told you something of what I know," Chesterton said, "but well, I hope I won't offend you, but you must understand certain things pretty thoroughly, to unite your wills with mine, and I don't know whether you'd. What sort of work do you do anyway?" "We're at Poole's Builder's Yard in Brichester," one told him. Chesterton was silent for so long that they wondered what had occurred to him. When he looked at them again, there was a new expression in his eyes. "I suppose I could teach you a little of the UNHHNGR basics. It would need weeks to get you to visualize dimensional projections, but maybe that won't be necessary if I can just give you a copy of the incantation, the correct pronunciation, and give you the lenses for the reversed angle view of matter if I can make any in time. Yes. Those plain glass spectacles would do if I put a filter over to progress the colors halfway. But you don't know what the devil I'm running on about. Come on, I'll drive you to my house." When they were driving down the A38, Chesterton broke the silence again. "I'll be frank. It was really because you work at Poole's that I accepted your aid. Not that I wouldn't be glad of help. It's a strain to use those other parts of the brain with only your own vitality to draw on. But there's so much I have to teach you, and only tonight to do it in. There wouldn't even be tonight, but it's crazy to attack while it's dark. No, I think I can use you more in another way, though perhaps you can help with the chant. So long as I still have the reproduction of that seal in the river. And so long as you can get used to artificial reversal of matter. I always do it without artificial help, because then it doesn't seem so odd." And as he drew up the car in the driveway off Bold Street, he called back, "Pray it stays near water to accustom itself to surface conditions. If it doesn't, they're parthenogenetic, all of them, and pretty soon there'll be a new race to clear off the earth. Humanity will just cease to exist." 4. The next day was one of sickly glowing sunlight and impending winds. Chesterton had copied out the formula in triplicate and given a copy to each of the men, retaining one for himself. Now, in mid-morning, the librarian and one of his helpers were going through the streets of Cloton, gradually approaching the riverside section. On the bank waited the third of the party, like his friend wearing the strange glasses which Chesterton had prepared the night before. His was the crucial part of the plan. The riverbank was otherwise bare, the human corpse and the others having been disposed of. Chesterton concentrated on his formula, awaiting the finding of what he knew lurked somewhere among the deserted red brick houses. Strangely, he felt little fear at the knowledge that the amphibian terror lurked nearby, as though he were an instrument of greater, more elemental forces. At the conclusion of the affair, upon comparing impressions, he found that his two companions had been affected by very similar feelings. Further, he discovered that all three had shared a vision, a strange mental apparition of a luminous star-shaped object, eternally rising from an abyss where living darkness crawled. Abruptly a gigantic shape flopped out of a side street, giving forth a deafening, half-intelligent croaking at the sight of the two men. It began to retrace its journey as Chesterton's accomplice started to chant the incantation, but Chesterton was already waiting some yards down the side street, and was commencing the formula himself. It gave a gibbering ululation and fled in the direction of the river, where the two followed it, never ceasing their chant. They were slowly driving it towards the riverbank, and what waited there? That chase must have resembled a nightmare, the slippery cobbles of the water-soaked street flashing beneath their feet, the antique buildings reeling and toppling on either side, and the flopping colossus always fleeing before them. And so the infamous building on Riverside Alley was passed, and the nightmarish procession burst out on the bank of the river. The third member of the party had been staring fixedly at the point at which they emerged, and so saw them immediately. He led in the clutch of the lorry in whose cab he sat, and watched in the rearview mirror while the two maneuvered the thing into the right position. Perhaps it sensed their purpose. At any rate, there was a hideous period when the being made rushes in every direction. But finally the man in the truck saw that it was in the correct position. They could not aim for the head organ of the being, for the flesh of the head was strangely opaque, as if the opacity could be controlled at will. But a bullet in the body paralyzed it, as Chesterton had deduced it would. Then the lorry driver moved a control in the cab, and the crucial act was performed. Upon the paralyzed body of the river creature poured a stream of fast-hardening concrete. There was a slight convulsive movement below the surface, suppressed as Chesterton recommenced the incantation. Then he snatched an iron bar which had been thoughtfully provided, and as quickly as possible carved a replica of that all-imprisoning seal below the bridge upon the semi-solid concrete surface. Afterwards, Chesterton put forward enough money to have the building firm erect a 20-foot tower over the spot, carved with replicas of the seal on each side. One never knew what agencies might later attempt to resurrect what they had buried. When the Cloton inhabitants began to trickle back, a chance remark by one of the two builders that more than one being could have escaped caused them to tear down the buildings in the riverside quarter, with Chesterton's approval and aid. They found nothing living, although Phipp's homestead yielded enough objects to drive one of the searchers insane and turn many of the others into hopeless drunkards. It was not so much the laboratory, for the objects in there were largely meaningless to most of the seekers, although there was a large and detailed photograph on the wall, presumably the original of that sketch Chesterton had acquired. But the cellar was much worse. The noises which came from beyond that door in the cellar wall were bad enough, and so were the things which could be seen through the reinforced glass partition in it. Some of the men were extremely disturbed by the steps beyond it, going down into pitch-black waters of terrifying depth. But the man who went mad always swore that a huge black head rose out of the ebon water just at the limit of vision, and was followed by a blackly shining tentacle which beckoned him down to unimaginable sights. As time passed, the remaining section of Cloton was repopulated, and those who know anything about the period of terror nowadays tend to treat it as an unpleasant occurrence in the past, better not discussed. Perhaps it ought not to be so treated. Not so long ago 2 men were fishing in the Tun for salmon, when they came upon something half submerged in the water. They dragged it out, and almost immediately afterwards poured kerosene on it, and set fire to it. One of them soon after became sufficiently drunk to speak of what they found, but those who heard him have never referred to what they heard. There is more concrete evidence to support this theory. I myself was in Cloton not so long ago, and discovered a pit on a patch of waste ground on what used to be Canning Road, near the river. It must have been overlooked by the searchers, for surely they would have spoken of the roughly cut steps, each carrying a carven 5-pointed sign, which led down into abysmal darkness. God knows how far down they go, I clambered down a little way, but was stopped by a sound which echoed down there in the blackness. It must have been made by water, and I did not want to be trapped by water, but just then it seemed to resemble inhuman voices croaking far away in chorus, like frogs worshipping some swamp-berry monster. So it is that Cloton people should be wary still near the river and the enigmatic tower, and watch for anything which may crawl out of that opening into some subterranean land of star-born abominations. Otherwise, who knows how soon the earth may return through forgotten cycles to a time when cities were built on the surface by things other than man, and horrors from beyond space walked unrestrained. In Memoria Additum, SCP-5509. The Art of War and Contamination. SCP-5509 is a highly invasive species of artificially created schistosome organisms, microscopic parasitic worms commonly known as blood flukes, proficient in the infection of and multiplying within human hosts. Unlike non-anomalous schistosomes, SCP-5509 instances are capable of releasing fertilized eggs into fresh water sources. These eggs are capable of infecting hosts through consumption or exposure to mucous membranes. Once within a host, the eggs will hatch before rapidly maturing. Short-term symptoms of SCP-5509 infestation are congruent with schistosomiasis, including skin lesions, fever, chills, headache, stomach pain, joint pain, cough, fatigue, and muscle aches. An SCP Foundation research report sent by Dr. Samira Golzer to Dr. Judith Lowe further explained this SCP. It reads, "This has to be an artificially mutated blood fluke. Schistosome infections are typically non-lethal in humans when treated with praziquantel or other antiparasitics, which kill the worms causing the infection. When treated with antiparasitic medications, SCP-5509 instances are highly sensitive to these treatments, and are thus easily cleared up by generic over-the-counter antiparasitics. This would normally be a good thing, as the cells dissolve and the organism itself dies. However, analysis of all known SCP-5509 instances has revealed the presence of both strains of SCP-3862 sigma, the pathogenic bacterial infection that is highly resistant to all commonly known antimicrobial therapies, and is considered biologically immortal. While mostly innocuous on their own, the two strains combine to manifest SCP-3862 sigma, the disease that killed my predecessor, Dr. Forrester. The more I study this, the more I believe that the SCP-5509 organisms were specifically created to be a biological containment and delivery system for SCP-3862 sigma, allowing 3862 sigma to spread undetected in the general populace. Furthermore, there are certain genetic markers in the SCP-5509 organism itself which make me think that they're all designed to die on their own at some point regardless of the presence of antiparasitics. There is no way for me to know how far this contagion is spread, but I can tell you that we're about to see a lot more cases of SCP-3862 sigma. End of report. As the origin and long-term effects of SCP-5509 are currently unknown, this file will be updated as new information becomes available. Projected SCP-5509 and SCP-3862 sigma short-term infection rates within NYC. A Stage 3 biohazard quarantine is being upheld within the Borough of Queens in New York City. The New York Hospital Med Center, temporarily designated Emergency Outpost B701, is being used as a treatment facility for SCP-5509 infected individuals. Assets within the CDC and New York City Department of Health are to continue to advise citizens against the consumption and use of unboiled tap water, under the guise of borough-specific water contamination. In conjunction with these efforts, several Foundation-backed nonprofit organizations will continue to distribute bottled water to affected areas in need. The medical department is consulting with the Kelapad Noga initiative to determine a possible cause for the spread of SCP-5509 and its connection to other Sarkic-related anomalies. The first known SCP-5509 infection was reported on September 2019 at 12:54 Greenwich Mean Time, from the New York Hospital Med Center in Queens, NYC. Within the next 6 hours, 103 new SCP-5509 related cases were discovered, leading to Foundation-led investigations into the situation. While initial attempts to quarantine and treat affected individuals appeared to be working, by September 2020 there were over 3,600 cases, prompting the Foundation to begin quarantine procedures for the entire borough of Queens. An exhaustive and rapid series of field examinations of the homes belonging to affected individuals first turned up no common factors. The infection initially appeared to be spreading at random, until all collected tap water samples in the infected homes revealed traces of SCP-5509, leading Foundation scientists to theorize that the water supply itself was the source. Foundation assets within the NYC municipal government attempted to contact the reservoir and aqueduct facilities responsible for water quality testing. Of the 13 facilities, the Ashokan Reservoir was the only non-responsive agency. Local law enforcement was used to perform an initial investigation, but contact was lost shortly after their arrival. Mobile Task Force Gamma 44, meat lockers, and a medical research team were dispatched to the Ashokan Reservoir for further investigation. Their video log transcript reads: Upon arriving at the testing facility, the investigation team discovered substantial damage to the front facade of the building. Captain Cobb instructed his team as they approached the front door of the building, "Heads on a swivel, boys. We don't know what we're getting into here." Upon entering the building, the team encountered evidence of a mass anomaly. The entrance hallway was coated with a thick, viscous substance resembling a combination of human excrement and gastropod secretions. Dr. Garden commented, "None of this is natural." Captain Cobb responded with frustration, "That's a hell of an understatement, document. I don't know what the hell kind of stuff they've got you doing that this is only not natural. Frankly, I don't want to know." Dr. Garden attempted to explain, "No, it's not that, it's just that humans don't secrete this kind of fluid." Captain Cobb sarcastically replied, "Well, golly gee, I'm so glad we have you here to tell us the patently obvious." However, the team soon encountered a horrifying sight in the main room of the facility. The remains of the facility staff were displayed above the central holding tank, fused together into an undulating mass suspended above the water vats by thick strands of tendon-like tissue. Dr. Garden realized, "My God, this has to be the source of the infection." But Captain Cobb instructed his team to clear the building before any samples were taken. Dr. Garden protested, "Time is important, Captain. I'd like to take samples before they expire." After assigning different areas to his team, Captain Cobb warned, "This is Black Lodge territory, and they always like leaving little surprises." Dr. Farley asked, "So you've dealt with them, B?" Suddenly, Agent Riley opened the rear access door, causing a bright flash that distorted the video feed before it abruptly terminated. End of log. Backup arrived at the remains of the facility approximately 25 minutes after the video terminated. The subsequent investigation concluded that the facility was destroyed through the detonation of a concealed explosive device. Testing of the water reservoir itself revealed a substantial infestation of SCP-5509, confirming the Ashokan Reservoir as a point of origin for known cases at the time. In the hours following this investigation, similar attacks were reported at several reservoirs along the Delaware, New Croton, and Catskill aqueducts. By September 9, 2019, an estimated 25% of the New York City population had been infested by SCP-5509. The operational protocol then updated as follows. All Foundation sites within the northeastern United States are to remain on lockdown. All sites within North America are to remain on standby until further notice. The Foundation has commandeered Center for Disease Control assets within SCP-5509 affected areas and will use these resources to help mitigate the spread of SCP-5509. In conjunction with the CDC and assets within mainstream media, a disinformation campaign has begun downplaying the severity of SCP-5509 and its impact on civilian populations. The New York tri-state area has been placed under a state of emergency, and the Department of External Affairs has executed Article 2, Section 33 of the Foundation Charter, and is in the process of directing state and federal officials to cede direct control over resources and infrastructure in SCP-5509 affected areas to the Foundation. The Ghatanothoa Initiative is working in conjunction with the Medical Department, an intelligence agency, to ascertain a treatment for SCP-5509 infections and an effective counter-strategy against the possible psychic threat. Additionally, the O5 Council has initiated Situation Delta 4 potential biological breach of veil scenario in order to begin preparation for wide-scale activation of Foundation assets for rapid response deployment. In conjunction with the NYPD, the Foundation has established 26 security checkpoints throughout New York City in an attempt to regulate travel and maintain peace. Mobile Task Force Pi-1, City Slickers, and NTF Gamma 44 have been dispatched to respond to a drastic increase in organized criminal activity throughout the city. In several instances, security checkpoints have been targeted by rioters, instigated by known members of GOI 0432, the Hunter's Black Lodge. There are currently an estimated 2.45 million SCP-5509 infected individuals within the New York metropolitan area. To date, the medical division has been unsuccessful in creating a viable method of removing SCP-5509 from an infected human host. Further testing has indicated that long-term SCP-5509 infection will result in an altering of brain chemistry, making infected individuals more susceptible to manipulation. This is confirmed by the high percentage of infected civilians engaging in directed criminal activity, with no prior history of such. It is believed that the UN itself is the primary target of this attack, as multiple heads of state are on site due to the General Assembly and the previously scheduled meeting of the UN Security Council. As there has been no coordinated global occult coalition response, the Foundation has initiated Operation Unison, in which a joint task force comprised of multiple mobile task forces will secure and evacuate high-priority targets. The UN Secretary-General and the special envoys to the UN Security Council will be transported to one of the secure locations designated in the Foundation Charter. Following their extraction, all other diplomatic and political officials will be secured as dictated by Field Command. The Ghatanothoa Initiative has been given provisional command over the Foundation response, with field operations being led by Commander Malachi Ben-Liraz. The SCP Foundation then sent an emergency notice to all Foundation personnel. It reads: on September 19, 2019 at 7:12 Eastern Standard Time, a Foundation convoy consisting of 42 Foundation security personnel and 5 transport vehicles arrived at the headquarters of the United Nations in Manhattan. Immediately following their arrival, a large serpentine organism emerged from the East River, destroying several security barricades and the Foundation convoy. The following footage was captured via Foundation audio-video equipment and CCTV security cameras. Location: Headquarters of the United Nations, Manhattan, New York City. Footage begins immediately following the arrival of the serpentine organism and the destruction of the Foundation convoy. Of the 42 agents sent by the Foundation, 4 survived the initial attack. Agents Marlowe and Jones quickly got up and aimed at the large serpentine creature that was about to devour the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo. Agent Jones called out on the radio, "Comms check, sound off. Who's out there?" Agent Lane was seen dragging herself from an overturned transport and responded, "Jones. I'm here, my leg is damned up pretty bad." Agent Hess asked, "What the hell is going on, Sarge?" Agent Jones instructed on the radio, "Regroup at the main entrance, do not engage. I repeat, do not engage." He then tried to call for backup, but was interrupted by a dark-skinned human figure dressed in chitinous armor and scarlet robes appearing before him, quickly severing his legs at the knees with a long scythe. The flesh around the wounds began to undulate and blister. Agent Marlowe charged at the attacker, but a thick tentacle reached from beneath Karsus Helena Eva's robe and lifted him into the air by his ankle. Karsus Helena Eva bellowed before bisecting Agent Marlowe vertically with its scythe. Agent Lane called out to her team, "Jones? Hess. Damn, what's going on?" Agent Hess asked for her position, to which Agent Lane replied, "I'm 4, maybe 5, meters south from Transport 3. Agent Hess realized he couldn't reach her without being spotted and apologized. "Shit, I'm not gonna reach you without being spotted. I am sorry, Lane. I gotta go for the entrance just play da." But Karsus Helena Eva quickly glided on a mass of writhing tentacles toward Agent Hess and stated, "So quick to abandon your comrades, you are not worthy of my Holocaust." With its left hand, Karsus Helena Eva picks Agent Hess up from the ground by his throat, then tosses him aside with ease in the direction of the large flesh beast. The serpentine creature catches the agent in its mouth and quickly devours him. The mutated corpse of Agent Jones reanimates. Using vascular tendrils, it drags itself towards Agent Lane. The agent discharges her firearm several times into her attacker, with no noticeable effect. Karsus Helena Eva watches as the reanimated corpse tears into Agent Jones, her screams cut short as it consumes her head. With one of its tendrils, the creature throws the feet of Agent Lane in front of Karsus Helena Eva. Karsus Helena Eva considers the offering for a moment before walking over to the large serpentine creature and jumps to its back. It points towards the building and the creature lunges forward in response. Karsus Helena Eva then said onwards, "The Ozirmak awaits." End of log. Internal security footage observed Karsus Helena Eva and its serpentine creature killing over 200 individuals, 126 of which were diplomatic officials, before collapsing the Secretariat building. After destroying the building, Karsus Helena Eva and its creature returned to the East River. The attacks took place over a 38-minute span. Foundation backup arrived moments after the collapse of the building. The footless remains of the Secretary-General and the special envoys were found impaled on chitinous spikes within the General Assembly building. SCP-5509 infections have been reported in the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Japan, India, Germany, Israel, South Korea, and China, with all current attempts to develop a pharmacological response proving ineffective. The number of SCP-5509 infected individuals is currently estimated at approximately 46 million. In the Court of the Dragon, by Robert W. Chambers. O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn. How long be crying mercy on them? God. Why, who art thou to teach and he to learn? In the church of Street Barnaby vespers were over, the clergy left the altar, the little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled in the stalls. A Swiss in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every fourth step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsignor C. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned toward the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ voluntarily ceased. I had always found the organ playing at Street Barnaby highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid if cold intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord I had felt a change for the worse, a sinister change. During vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir, but now and again, quite wantonly as it seemed, from the west gallery where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at the serene peace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at Street Barnaby, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. I had read of such things happening, too, but not in works on architecture. Then I remembered that Street Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th-century rococo. But now vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords, fit to accompany meditation, while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil! Whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns, still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monseigneur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now, at last, the preacher had made the sign of the cross, and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered Street Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body, and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favorite church for healing. For I had been reading The King in Yellow. The sun ariseth. They gather themselves together and lay them down in their dens. Monseigneur C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes, and passing along the gallery on his way out, I saw him disappear by a small door that leads to some stairs which descend directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here, at last, was the ease of mind I longed for. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn. That it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that with the Fathers. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on, in his coolest, clearest tones, because... But I never heard the rest. I left his face, I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ, and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank, and yet, his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes, a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. Then he disappeared by the same door through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt, when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful. And this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before. For the moment all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted. But in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, Street Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even colored glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that, when I was turned toward it, whatever moved at the west end could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed, it was no wonder that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and his second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was a likely place to harbor supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monseigneur C., his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head, and almost laughed. That flyaway lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind, at the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her gold trumpet at him, and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which, at the time, I thought very amusing, and sat and chaffed myself and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing, who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair, before she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monseigneur C. himself. For all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it for the jingle in my ears of the skirts of Street Paul has reached. Having preached us those 6 Lent lectures, more unctuous than ever he preached, keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Street Honoré, as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths in a golden cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure-seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best I could into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde and on to the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods, on the faraway arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of gray stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cours la Reine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across to the Champs-Élysées and turned toward the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate. And still I tried to save myself. The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it, and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing: the will, and the power to work me evil. In anguish I watched him where he went down the broad crowded avenue, that was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Garde Républicaine. He was soon lost to sight, then I turned and fled. Into the Bois, and far out beyond it, I know not where I went, but after a long while, as it seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at a table before a small café. I had wandered back into the Bois. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired, so tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home. But that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue du Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue de Rennes is a balcony, supported by an iron dragon. Within the court tall old houses rise on either side, and close the ends that give on the two streets. Huge gates, swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways, close this court, after midnight, and one must enter then by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects unsavory pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open on the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers, and by iron workers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavory as it is below, there is cheerfulness, and comfort, and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live I was young, and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along, and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive of more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fate-makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them, with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung high up, in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him, 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly, nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward down the court I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue du Dragon. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street. But the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue du Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suisse's staff in the south aisle, preceding Monseigneur C. to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbor, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin bent arm in its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it. For I knew him now. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, they had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do, and now I knew while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away, the arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens. And the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the king in yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God."